Congresswoman, great to see you. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me back on, Sean.
You bet. So earlier this week, the House passes this Protection of Women and Girls Act in sports. I don't think this is that controversial. Apparently, only 2 Democrats could be brave enough to do this. Why was this a partisan issue?
You know, for so long, especially under the Biden administration, they've been pushing, I would say, more protections for trans individuals than actual young women. And so, as you saw, there was biological males competing in women's sports, destroying our records, really pushing away and aside some incredible female athletes. And so it's terrible that we have to even do this piece of legislation, because you would think that it's common sense. But unfortunately, the woke ideology did take hold of the Biden administration. And so we're correcting a lot of the wrong and damage that was done.
So the thing that I've never really understood about this argument, did you play sports as a kid or as in college?
Of course. Like yeah, of course.
I mean, I look, I got a daughter and I'm like, okay, I thought part of the whole idea of like Title IX was, hey, we're going to give women opportunities. If I'm a woman who was the beneficiary of this, right, whether in high school or college or whatever, and then I see men, biological men coming in and taking away those things, in any other circumstance, I would think that this would create outrage among women who fought for these rights, and yet the Democrats are siding with the biological men.
Correct. It's actually very ironic, because just to even go into Pete Hegseth's confirmation, you know, these women are arguing that women need to be put on the front lines and women need to be like literally tip of the spear combat. And yet they are literally actively also at the same time trying to waste women and sports, women's records of accomplishments in the Olympics. It is pretty sad, right? Because there are a lot of women that I think would consider themselves feminists, and they don't even fully know where they fall anymore, because the Democrat Party seems to be increasingly pushing these crazy ideologies that just don't align with normal people. But exactly like you said, Sean, you know, I'm a woman, I've played sports, and I can tell you one of the most disturbing things I saw is that women were actually getting hurt going up against these biological males, regardless of how, you know, transition they were. And so I think that that's something to also note, and that you don't literally want a man, it's never commonly publicly acceptable for a man to hit a woman unless it's a trans athlete, and then the Democrats are like perfectly okay with it.
Do you ever, I mean, I just don't know, like from a social circle or a congressional circle, like, do you ever like have these where you're like, hey guys, I get it, like politically on the left, you got to do what you got to do for the folks, either your colleagues or some people maybe in your friend group, I don't know. And you go, hey, I got it. You guys have to say these things, but like, do you really believe them? I just always wonder, are they agreeing to these things because they have to get along on the left, or do they actually believe this?
I mean, I think that some of them actually believe it, and you can tell those are the ones that'll put, you know, the trans flags outside of their office over a POW MIA flag. You know, a lot of these people sometimes tend to represent these very, very blue districts. But I would argue and say this, you know, at the end of the day, if you are, let's say, a Democrat, Democrats like to, a lot of times, especially when Trump's speaking, we're too white to signify women's suffrage and women's votes, but yet they're sitting here and actively working at erasing our ability to compete. So, you know, I say this, I have a very common sense approach. I'm not trying to tell people what to do in their bedroom, but when you were talking about taking away accomplishments and really some incredibly talented athletes, not even giving them a chance because the playing field is stacked against them when they're going up against these males, that's where I choose to get involved. And frankly, any university that's receiving federal funding, any state that's receiving federal funding and is coddling this, is seeking to waste women and really take us out of the discussions, they don't need to get federal funds.
Yeah, you mentioned Pete Hegseth's confirmation, right? And you're a veteran. You served in the Air Force. I was sort of taken back by some of the Democrat female senators and their line of questioning to Pete Hegseth, like very personal. You had Tim Kaine talking about his divorce.
Oh, it's nasty.
As like a female veteran, what do you want the message to be to women out there who are being told by the left that Pete Hegseth is this monster of a man?
Well, first of all, it's categorically false. So part of the reason why I specifically went there and sat through a majority of the confirmation is because I wanted to hear from my own ears what they were saying. You know, I'm a veteran, I'm a minority, I'm a member of Congress. But more importantly, I am concerned and I want to see the military get back to the lethal, respected fighting force that it previously was. And what I was listening to is how Pete was going to respond, what his vision was for the Department of Defense. And yet this sideshow seemed to be the distraction, the focus. They obviously had all coordinated their line of questioning, and they kept taking things that he was saying out of context, right? Like they're saying, oh, Pete, you don't want women to serve in the military. That simply is not true. They wanted to get into Pete's record on women in combat. And just like Pete, I hold the same ideology and perspective that there are certain roles that women do serve an incredible capacity in the Department of Defense. And there are certain parts of combat that they would be great at, right? So like in different parts of the world, there are female sniper teams that actually tend to outperform the males. There's different units that they can be assigned to. However, do I want to see women being forced to register for the draft? Absolutely not. That was something that Senate Democrats were actually pushing. Do I want to see women placed on special forces teams?
They
no.
were pushing. They want women to be drafted. Is that? I didn't. No kidding.
Yeah, well, yeah, they did. They actually, in one of the previous NDAs, Senate Democrats were actually pushing to forcibly register women for the draft. And we then stripped it out. GOP lawmakers on the Senate side said, no, that's not going to happen. But this is the ideology and perspective of, might I remind you, many people in Senate who've never actually served in the Department of Defense or even had their own family members serving. So yes, they were trying to register your daughters for the draft, which is completely wrong. But do I want to see women on special forces teams? Here's my perspective on that, and I hold the same sentiments as Pete Hegseth. They did a study, and they found that when men in these types of scenarios saw an injured woman, that it was in their nature to go and defend that woman, right? That is that quote unquote toxic masculinity of defending a woman that the left tries to constantly attack conservatives and Republicans on, and even men on. And the fact is that if you have a woman that is on a special forces team, regardless of what the focus is of the mission, if she gets hurt, every single man on that team is going to biologically respond and try to help her, as they should. That can jeopardize the entire mission. That can get more people hurt. And so in looking at lethality and looking at actually how to take a military and create the best fighting force on the face of the planet, those are all things that need to be considered. That's what Pete was saying, not what this skewed, perverted perspective that the Democrat senators were trying to push.
As an Air Force veteran, one of the things that I wonder what your perspective is, that like I was amazed at the number of personal questions about Pete's divorce, Pete's previous veteran service organizations that he worked for, et cetera. And yet I'm like, okay, well, in the Air Force, you've got a lot of old planes. In the Navy, we have a lot of ships that need to be replaced, right? And there were so few questions.
None of it was on that.
I mean, not even so few. There wasn't, I think I can count one about policy. And it just blows my mind that it's like, really, is that what you Democrats care about, is personal life? And I'm not saying that there's no value to some degree of asking somebody about some of these things. But the idea that basically not a single Democrat focused in on policy was kind of mind-blowing.
Yeah, unfortunately, what I've realized in my very short time in politics is that if you are a white male, if you're a male in general, we can look at what happened with the confirmations of our Supreme Court justices that were males and how they were treated if they were put up by a Republican president and or if they were conservative leaning. We can see what happened with other confirmations in the past, that they will automatically attack your character. You will automatically be essentially demonized and labeled as a serial rapist with a drug problem. And that's unfortunately the political landscape that the Democrat Party, I would say, is largely responsible for creating. But it also, too, can unfortunately sometimes happen on the Republican side. And that stuff needs to stop. It should be based on merit. Now, I do applaud Pete Hegseth as when he first opened up his line in response to one of the initial questions on the confirmation, he directly addressed it. He did not run away from the issue, and he put that issue to rest. And so that should be something that those Democrat senators should have acknowledged, moved past it, and gotten to policy and perspective. What is your vision for the Department of Defense? But they didn't do that. And so I would just say that he did an incredible job. He didn't give them their sound bites. I do believe, and I'm hearing that he has the votes for confirmation. And so I look forward to looking with Secretary of Defense Hegseth and making our military strong as ever.
You guys down there in Florida seem to be doing pretty well. You got a president of the United States who's about to come into office. Yeah. You got a Secretary of State in Marco Rubio, an Attorney General in Pam Bondi. I'm trying to think. I'm sure I'm missing a ton of other people. Like, it seems like you guys are
the
now
president.
No, I said, yeah. I mean,
States.
yeah, that's not a bad one too. But I mean, like you're doing pretty well there in Florida, breeding. You know, Susie Wiles, the incoming chief of staff's from Florida.
James
Blair. I forgot that James Blair's from there. I mean, is it? Do you think it's all disproportionate because President Trump's from down there, or is it just happenstance that a lot of these great people are qualified for the right role and happen to be from Florida?
I just think that it happens to be on qualifications. A lot of what Florida has been messaging on, and really what I was arguably joking about before the DeSantis teams really started branding it, was Make America Florida. And,
right.
you know, I think a lot of our political ideologies, especially during COVID, a lot of these national figures started rising up saying, hey, we don't agree with the lockdowns. We want, you know, service members to be reinstated that were discharged. Really took a hard stance against the totalitarian push that the Biden administration was incoming with, right? And so I think that you'll find that there's a lot of other people from other parts of the country that are getting these phenomenal positions and nominations. For goodness sakes, we have a Kennedy that's going to be hopefully, you know, up for a nomination here and confirmation here pretty soon. I think, but the fact is that Florida really has, I think, pushed Texas out of the way. I always tease my Texas colleagues on that, and that we're, you know, taking their former title of being the most conservative state.
That's true. I mentioned Marco Rubio. I want to get to something that I know you're dealing with at the State Department now, and the contrast that's going on. Before I do, I mean, is there any thought about who Governor DeSantis should appoint?
You know, I will say that I have been seeing him say on a regular basis that he's not going to be appointing a member of Congress. And, you know, that's his decision to make. But I would caution the governor with this, and that if he does not appoint someone that's very conservative, there is going to be a very brutal primary for that seat. And whoever President Trump endorses in 2026 will win. That's just the landscape that's been created, not just in Florida, but nationally as well. And so I do hope that the governor, I ultimately know it's his decision. We respect his decision, and I have a great working relationship with the governor. But I hope that he also talks to President Trump on that, because, again, what we don't want in Florida is a brutal primary.
You know, we talk a lot about personnel and nominations because that's kind of like the hip thing. But there's a lot of policy that's going to change. And I don't think we always appreciate some of the subtle changes and approaches to things that are going to change with this new administration. And one of the things that I think you guys are dealing with there is there's a whistleblower at the State Department talking about what's happening still within the Department of State and under the Biden administration. Can you walk us through what you know?
Yeah, so actually my office just received a call to onboard, and we're in the process of onboarding actually a whistleblower from JSOC who's a MARSOC Raider. So,
okay, well, just explain so just for people who are sitting there, like, what do you mean by you saying onboarding and MARSOC and JSOC? Because I know what you're talking about, but not everyone speaks
military acronyms. Got it. So my office has the ability, and any congressional office can offer whistleblower protections. So if you're a federal employee and you come forward with information of corruption, whatever it might be, we can take that information and investigate. So my office was contacted by a military member who's basically the special operations version of the Marine Corps. He's a MARSOC officer. So long story short, to put it in a nutshell, we have information that was given to us that the State Department not only covered up and tried to delete the profile of an individual that's currently in the United States that's on the known terrorist watch list, but in an effort to undermine the previous Trump administration, they actually put a little girl, or are attempting to put a little girl into this individual's custody. So obviously we don't want children in the custody of terrorists, for one. And B, as a result of them intentionally undermining President Trump's previous decision in this custody case for this little girl, she was sent to Afghanistan, where she was actually sexually assaulted at 1 year old. And so my office is currently in the process of receiving that information. I am going to be blowing the lid on this. I am now currently sitting on Foreign Affairs. And so I've actually talked to Congressman Mass, who's our chairman. When I'm telling you, Sean, that there is no way that I'm going to let these people get away with that, I seriously mean it, especially because there's a child involved. But, you know, unfortunately, policy, they don't care about who gets hurt in the process. And that's a very big difference between the Biden administration, the Biden State Department, and the incoming one with Trump.
So do you think this is like a political thing, or is this some career idiot doing the wrong thing?
It was political. They knew because this whole custody issue started under the Trump administration, and it was handled after Biden took over the State Department under Biden, reversed that decision. This little girl, as a result of that, was sent back to Afghanistan. She was sexually assaulted. They found her, brought her back to the States, and then there was actually coordinated, orchestrated efforts, not just with the State Department, but with the FBI, to then go after this whistleblower, of which his command at JSOC got involved. Some Ranger Battalion guys got involved, gave statements. Honestly, it's something that you would hear in a movie, and I know that's kind of the 18,000 foot level in the way that I'm explaining this, but because of the fact that we need to receive documentation and I need to officially get him onboarded as protected under my office for a whistleblower, there's certain information that I can't release at this time, but I'm not gonna let these people get away with it. It's wrong. I know that incoming Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, will definitely be helping, and I'm also in the process of reaching out to Harmeet Dillon so that this never happens again.
When you hear stuff like that, I honestly, there's days in which, as long as I've been involved in like politics and whatever, I go, there's no way. There's just, and what you said was absolutely right. This sounds like something out of a movie, right? The idea that just stop for a second and go, okay, so there's someone on the terrorist watch list that they're allowing to stay in. That in itself, full stop.
Exactly.
Then a young child involved, and you're going, does this just make your blood boil sometimes as a person that's still new to politics to say, there's no way that people in our government are allowing this crap to happen?
It does, but I think many people watching this, to include you, Sean, as a parent, as a mom of a 1.5-year-old, I just could not imagine that decision that would cause a little girl to be sexually assaulted because of politics, and it pisses me off. And I do look forward to bringing those names to the Secretary of State, to bring those names to Harmeet Dillon, and to ensuring that those people are fired. In fact, if it were up to me, I think that the family should be able to seek some form of restitution for what that little girl went through. I know that President Trump's administration will solve it, but when you are in positions of power, even my position, your decisions have consequences. And those decisions had consequences. And that fact is that however old that little girl was, she's never going to be the same because of that. So those people will have something to, I think, address with God when it's their time.
Yeah, I mean, thank God you're dealing with it. How often does something like that happen, that somebody calls your office and says, I want to be a whistleblower for, maybe government waste or inefficiencies, or somebody stealing for the government, or God forbid a case like this?
I'd say that of all the things we've heard so far, this has probably been the worst, and mainly because I've seen like actual photo documentation.
But I mean, how often does somebody call your congressional office and say, I want to be a whistleblower because I've seen some enough? What?
All the time. We have a ton actually over at the Department of Veteran Affairs that our office has received. A lot of that has been resolved in that we didn't have to launch the investigations because we had the information. Those people were fired or dismissed. But also to Secretary McDonough over at the VA actually stopped taking my calls because I was also having issues with some of the VA hospitals under my purview and watch. And so, again, I mean, that's just one section of the federal government.
Wait, just so we're clear, by the way, I'm sorry, Congresswoman, the idea that the Secretary of the Veterans Affairs Department doesn't take the call of a member of Congress who is a veteran talking about malfeasance. You want to talk about qualifications about Pete Hegseth and so, and the guy who shouldn't have ever been confirmed as Secretary of the VA won't take your calls to talk about veterans?
He stopped taking our calls, and as a result of that, we had a case at the local VA that I believe was directly correlated to poor treatment, resulted in suicide, and as a result of that, the directors of different departments at that VA ended up resigning and/or early retirement. And again, this was something that we were flagging early on for the secretary. Yep.
Well, look, I'll just say this. Thank God you're there. Thank God that you're taking these calls, because people need to know that somebody in government is going to be responsive. So thank you for being with us, and thanks for what you're doing. You've served this country already. You're continuing to serve. You continue to speak out, and you're getting results. So I appreciate your time, and thanks. Again, this is what we need more of in government, people who actually are serving the people, not serving themselves. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you. And Sean, as soon as I get that profile of that terrorist, I'm going to give it to you to put out there first, because we need to ensure that the American people know.
Done. Thank you, Congresswoman.
Thanks, guys.
Well, if you enjoyed this content, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and click the notification bell to get more.